Let's talk 750 CFM versus 600 CFM. Let's talk double pumper versus vacuum secondary. And let's do it all with me giving you all kinds of tips how to perfect a carburetor for daily driving using my glorious red duster that is my daily with a stock 360 in it. I'll tell you, this episode is not about peak horsepower. It's about drivability and making it great, making you love it so that you want to use your old car every day. Before we dig into that, let me remind you, I am giving away my 1990 Chevy Suburban 4x4 and $5,000. So before December 7th, 2025, go to my website, shop.davidfreiburger.com. The link is in the description and enter to win. You can either buy my merchandise or you can send in a card. No purchase necessary, although I would love it if you would buy something. So check out the rules at my website and you could win before December 7th, 2025. But now, let's get into the juiciness of fiddling around with carburetors and giving you the answer of 750 double pumper versus 600 vacuum secondary for your car. Carburetor. All right, if you follow my channel, you know that I recently did a very extensive video on how to tune a Holley-type carburetor using this 750 double pumper brawler carb atop my nearly bone stock 360 Magnum. Just to review, this engine is a junkyard 5.9 Magnum, and it has the stock camshaft in it, stock rocker arms, stock heads. The only mods are really the Edelbrock RPM air gap intake manifold and the TTI headers. And so that means it makes a lot of vacuum. It's basically a stocker, which is why at the end of my episode, I had to begrudgingly admit that the 750 double pumper is not quite the right carburetor for this application. Now, I made it work. And extensively in that episode, I showed you all the tuning that it took to get the stumble out of it. So on that subject, let me say two things about all of the feedback that I got on that episode. First of all, people criticized me for running manifold vacuum for the vacuum advance on the distributor. I'll give you that one. In different applications, you might want to run the ported manifold vacuum, meaning it doesn't have vacuum at idle. It only has vacuum once you tip into it. And in different applications, you might want manifold vacuum. So that is something you can test back and forth. Now, the other thing that I didn't mention is the accelerator pump cam. A lot of people said, you know, if you had just messed with that, you would have gotten rid of your stumble. And so that's what we're going to test here. I have returned this carburetor to the stock spec as far as the idle air bleed. I had put in ridiculously small ones in the prior episode to try and activate the transfer slot sooner and to try and make it richer on the idle so that it wouldn't stumble like that. So that's back to stock. The other thing that I had done is I had screwed the rear idle mixture screws all the way in, eliminated their functionality, and did all of my idle adjusting with the front screws in order to make it richer locally up at the front throttle blades to help eliminate that stumble. And those are two things that I shouldn't have had to do and probably are because the Venturis are too big on this 750 carb for this particular engine, although it makes a lot of vacuum, so that doesn't make a ton of sense. Anyway, in returning the carburetor to stock, I can go ahead and play with the pump cam, and I'll show you all about that, and see if the audience was correct that that was going to fix it. I got a new pump cam from my handy dandy accelerator pump tuning kit from Holley. Let me take this one off and then I'll explain to you what this is all about. I took out the stock pump cam, which is pink, which is not aggressive at all, and now it's on the ground. So let me talk to you about what pump cams do, and now I'll have to use the example of the blue cam that I didn't drop. So the shape of the cam right here determines the rate at which the carburetor activates the arm on the accelerator pump diaphragm in relation to degrees of rotation of the throttle. Basically, it's When you snap the throttle, how quickly does it start squirting the fuel? That's the short version. The pink one that I just dropped there is the least aggressive. This blue one is the most aggressive. I will say that you can find online a number of graphs of Holley pump cams, and they don't all agree with each other. The blue one has the quickest acceleration of that pump lever with the least amount of rotation of the throttle arm. And so we're going to give that a shot and see if it covers up that stumble. Oh, I should also tell you that each pump cam has holes in it that are marked 1 and 2, or sometimes 1, 2, and 3. And that is the hole in which you screw the thing into position on the linkage. And hole number 1 is the most aggressive, and 2 and 3 are least aggressive as you go. I've never used hole 2 or 3. I've also never used pump cam blue. So let me throw this junk in. We'll see what happens. The pump cam is on. The other thing that is critical anytime you change that cam is to readjust this spring and bolt that makes contact with the lever that actually pumps the diaphragm for the fuel discharge through the squirter. And I have done that. That's that doohickey right here. Shorten that spring up because the cam profile is way different. I think I mentioned I've never run a blue cam, and I have to admit, it activates that squirter fast. You know what? In case you're curious about the squirter, I'm going to show you the one that is on the rear of this carburetor because it's really difficult to see the one in the front past the choke plate. And so I'm going to squirt this and show you what happens with the fuel coming out of that squirter. What does the squirter do? Well, it's there to cover up that transition in between the idle circuit and acceleration, because right when you snap the throttle open, there isn't enough airspeed to create enough pressure drop to push fuel through the carburetor. And so just squirting raw fuel down there covers up any kind of a bog. Typically, I've used it for a bog, like you snap it to wide open and it goes ball. This will be the first time I've used it for just that tiny off-idle tip-in, and I think the audience is going to be correct because it squirts pretty fast. All right, let's fire it up and find out. Wow, it activates right away. Let's go drive this garbage. All right, I'm out test driving, and I can tell you that did not fix the problem. Wow, it's way worse than my prior fix from my previous episode. Let me see, and that was just driving off from a stop sign. Let me see what it does from a roll. See, I've got it at lower RPM and I'm just tipping in a little. Nope, still does it. It just hits a lean spot and then it recovers as I continue to press on it, which is probably when the pump shock comes in. So basically that solution did not work as well as my prior one. Now we're going to test my other theory, which is to go home and install a 600 CFM vacuum secondary and find out if that was truly the better carburetor for this application. Yeah, just does not work. Let me tip it in again. Nope. It's no good. Loser! That did not work at all. So before I do anything drastic changing this carburetor, I think for you naysayers, I'm going to go ahead and move the vacuum advance line from manifold vacuum to ported vacuum to see if that makes it any better. And you know what? I think I showed you before I tested that pump cam. I'm willing to be wrong here. I'm willing for you guys to be right, especially if it makes my car run better. So let me make that change, then we'll see. Okay, I'm testing ported vacuum versus manifold vacuum. Here goes ported vacuum. No. Not fixed. Okay, peeps, I'm back home, and I think we just showed that the aggressive pump cam and the vacuum advance change didn't do anything. This carburetor and the drivability were way better at the end of the last episode that I did on carburetors. So all of you who gave me advice in all caps or with a bunch of exclamation points, or who said that you were shouting at the screen that I should have done this, that, and the other, you were wrong. Now, I will say, you're not always going to be wrong, and I'm not always going to be right. This carburetor stuff needs to be tested. But for you to assume that it would have fixed it immediately with either one of these changes clearly didn't happen in this case. So I am going to go to my theorem from the end of my carburetor episode, which is that this thing really should have more of a street carburetor on it. And that's going to be a 600 vacuum secondary. Let me show you that. This is my new 600 CFM vacuum secondary QFT Slayer carburetor. This one is a 4160 series. That means that it only has a metering block in the front, and the back, you can see there's nothing in between the main body and the float bowl. It has a metering plate. This thing does have center hung float bowls, so it looks cool and racy. A little bit more than the 1850, the really old series Holley 600 vacuum secondary that has the side hung bowls. This just looks a little bit cooler, but that's not the reason I chose it. Let me take this thing apart and show you what's what. My brand new carburetor is scattered to the wind. Let me show you why I wanted this particular model. First of all, externally, see this vacuum pod right here? That controls the vacuum secondaries. And this little screw is indicated S and F, slow and fast. You can externally adjust the opening point and opening rate of the vacuum secondaries. Now, with a regular Holley, you can get a quick release cover so that you can change springs really fast. Well, this is easier. It's on a lot of QFT carbs. I really like it. Second of all, look at the secondary half of the carburetor right here. This is a metering plate rather than a metering block, but this is the thing that they came out with many years ago that was really good versus the ancient carburetors. It does have changeable jets, so that is a plus. Now we go into the primary metering block, and importantly, you can see that it has adjustable idle feed restrictors. So this is where the fuel comes up and is mixed with air right there through the idle air bleed and goes down and out to the mixture screw. And so that is adjustable on this carburetor. It was not on my old Brawler. Also, it has jets for an adjustable power valve restriction, so you can adjust how much fuel is getting enriched into the carburetor when the power valve opens. So being the carburetor geek that I am, I thought those were really cool features. That's why I got this carburetor. But let's hope I slam it directly on the car and it runs perfectly. Let me put this thing back together now. Okay, it's morning and it's bright enough that we can see stuff. Let's install that carburetor. Okay, I've got the carburetor off. Let's talk just a little bit. This is an Edelbrock RPM air gap intake manifold. It's a dual plane. I've often said that the RPM manifold is the best for street and strip for V8s under 6,500 RPM, and I think that's true here also. However, I will note that between the two planes, there is a vertical divider and they do not have a cutout in it. Now, in dyno testing, we have found out that typically a dual plane for high RPM use likes to have that little notch in the divider so that you're sharing plenum volume from side to side. I'm not exactly sure what it does, but I know that it tends to make 3 to 10 horsepower in that range, and of course pick up gains everywhere in the curve above peak torque. Now, the other thing that you can do for that is add a carburetor spacer. It has kind of the same effect, plus adding a lot more plenum volume. And so I do like a 1-inch open carb spacer or tapered combo on top of the RPM intake manifold. I'm not saying it works every time. I always use the word tends. It tends to work, meaning way above average in my testing, it works. That's not to say that it works every single time. Now, for this engine that probably won't run past about 4,000 before valve float, I'm not worrying about it. And so let's install that 600 vacuum secondary. Before I hang this thing off my garbage, I wanted to tell you one more thing, which is all about vacuum secondary operation. People are confused by it. To begin with, mechanical secondaries or a double pumper are really easy because you open the throttle and mechanically it opens all the throttle blades. In this case, your foot only controls the primary or the front barrels in the carburetor, and there's no linkage from there to the secondary. The linkage for the secondary is only attached to this vacuum pod. And people think vacuum secondary has something to do with intake manifold vacuum. It doesn't at all. I suppose intake manifold vacuum is affected by the same conditions that affect the vacuum that opens the secondaries, but that's getting too complicated. Don't worry about that. So the way it opens is as a result of this little tiny hole that appears in the right front carburetor barrel on the 4-barrel, and that hole is right at the pinch of the venturi. So as air is coming through there, it speeds up, and when air speeds up, it has a pressure drop. That's how the carburetor draws fuel out of the booster. But that pressure drop can also be used to induce what we would call a vacuum on the vacuum secondary pod. And inside that pod, there is a diaphragm with a spring on top of it. And the vacuum in there, at some point, overcomes the tension of the spring. And the spring can adjust the opening point and the rate of opening of the secondaries. And then, as that vacuum diaphragm pulls up against the spring, this piece of linkage right here moves up and down and opens the secondaries. So what this does for you is if you're cruising along at very light throttle with the throttle blades almost closed, the airspeed is not that much through the primaries, and so you're only driving on the primaries. As you floor it, the airspeed increases, it induces a vacuum because of that little hole, and then it sucks open the secondaries. And a lot of people think a vacuum secondary is much slower than a double pumper because they think that it doesn't open all the way. I will tell you, on the dyno, I have seen vacuum secondaries not open all the way, but you can tune around that and make it right. So sometimes that takes some fiddling with springs. In this case, it's just going to take me turning this screw right here. All right, now you get it. Now I'm going to bolt it onto my junk. The carburetor's bolted on now, and here's the next thing that I'm going to have to change is my fuel inlet, because this is a 4160 carburetor. It doesn't have that secondary metering plate, and so the bowls are closer together. The center to center is different, and so that's one thing that you're going to need to pay attention to. I could have shortened the hose on my old one and used it, but I wanted to leave that carburetor ready to bolt on, ready to go, and so I bought another one. This is from a place called Red Horse Performance, and it's extremely similar, if not identical, to the Summit one that I took off. The carburetor's all bolted on. I think I'm ready to turn on the electric fuel pump and see what leaks I created. But first, when I was installing the carb, I was reminded of something that I wanted to talk to you about, and that is, in my first episode, In Depth on Carburetors, I was telling you about how you can't just guess what jets go in a carburetor based on what the engine is. And what that's based on is a lot of people will say, oh, it's a small block, you need 68s in the front, 72s in the back. And you know what, that's actually close, but it really depends on the carburetor size, because the smaller the venturi, the more pressure drop it creates, and the smaller the jet it might need. A lot of people say, oh, you put that big CFM carburetor on there, it uses a lot of gas. Look at the jets, they're 80s. Well, that's because the larger venturi has less pressure drop, so it needs more jet area to be able to deliver the same amount of fuel. Carburetor spacers. When you use a open carb spacer, no holes in it, it tends to reduce signal to the carburetor, and as a result, it tends to need just a little bit more jetting. Conversely, if you put a 4-hole spacer on, sometimes it will create more pressure drop, and it will actually suck more fuel out of the carburetor and go rich, and you'll have to lean it out a little bit. I'm not as confident about saying anything about the 4-hole as I am about the open. The open spacer, as we've seen on the dyno many times, typically leans out the engine, especially on a dual plane and a little bit on a single plane. So just keep that in mind. Let's fire up the fuel pump and watch leaks happen. Fuel pump's running. Everything looks good, float level, no leaks. The idle mixture screws were set to 1 1/4 turns out. So that's going to be my starting point here, and when we fire it up, I will adjust them and look for peak manifold vacuum. Let's start it. Had to give it a couple pumps. It's running perfectly, it seems. I should mention that I backed the choke all the way off, so it is not functional right now at all. So it's just running without a choke. Wow, this seems pretty good. Will it lean out a little? Man, it's idling nice. I have a vacuum gauge in there and also an AFR gauge, and it's idling at about 20 inches of vacuum and 13.5 to 1 AFR, and it seems really happy. There is a fuel leak there from the plug for the gauge. I hate those NPT plugs that are in fuel lines. They always leak, so I'm gonna have to deal with that. Here's the problem. Listen. When you snap it all the way open, it has a pretty bad bog. So without even going to drive it, I'm gonna pull out the front squirter, and I would have money on the fact that it's a 31, and I'm gonna change it to a 35. Here are my squirters or shooters or accelerator pump discharge nozzles. And as I presumed, this one is a number 31. I will go to a number 35. That is a bigger hole in the shooter. And what that does is gives you more fuel sooner, but it does not change the total volume of fuel that is squirted out each time you mash the accelerator pedal. You get the same volume because that diaphragm in the accelerator pump is moving the same distance every time. It's just with a smaller hole on the shooter, you get a tinier stream for a longer period of time, and with a bigger hole you get a big shot of fuel that doesn't last as long. Now I should also show you this one right here, which is also a number 35, but this is what I call a siphon squirter. I don't know if that's the correct terminology. You can see that it's got these extra long nozzles on it right there, and what I've found about those is that they extend the shooter further into the airstream, and I think that creates some pressure drop, and it actually siphons fuel out of them at wide open throttle. I've seen it a bunch of times with a GoPro on a carburetor on the dyno. It is absolutely feeding a bunch of fuel out of the squirter into the engine. And sometimes it'll do it with a regular squirter too, but it seems to me that it is more common with this type. And of course it moves the discharge, I guess, closer to the center line of the barrel. I can't be honest that I know why they make these, but anyway, that is the story. I'm gonna go put the number 35 in, attempting not to drop the little tiny round gasket down my engine. Will the squirter fix it? Stay tuned and find out in about 13 seconds. Oh, but first, I forgot to tell you that the accelerator pump arm spring is adjusted perfectly. So that's not it. So if this doesn't work, I'm probably gonna go to the pump cam. Let's see if it works. Gasoline. Fires right up instantly. I'd say improved. Okay. I'm going to see if I can improve that with a pump cam like I did on that other carburetor. That's the plan. Here's what happened. You saw me changing that pump cam. And the first one I went to was the brown, which has a pretty good initial hit and more sustain. So I installed that, fiddled with the linkage a lot, bent a little tab on it to make sure that I had that just perfect. And the thing still had just a little bit of a bog. And so I went to the blue cam, the same one that I used on that other carburetor. And I ended up having to move to a 37 squirter. And of course, the perfectly adjusted linkage. So now I think the Slayer slays. Check this out. I'm going to fire it up. Okay. Perfection. Yes, I feel great about that. It might be different in the car though when we're driving it and have load and everything else. So that's the next thing, road test. Well, I have been out cruising this thing and I can tell you it is great. Watch this, I'm just gonna let out the clutch and drive away at really low RPM. Not a stumble to be had. And remember, that was the problem with my last carburetor, was just that very light tip-in stumble. It wasn't the bog that I just dealt with on this one at all. But man, this thing's good. Right now I'm cruising in second gear at, I don't have a tach, but I'd have to guess 2,000 RPM, high load, and I just whack it and it takes off. No bog at all. So I am super stoked with this so far. In cruising over here, I was able to see that at very, very light throttle, just like through the city, barely on it, cruising 35. The thing's at 15:1 air-fuel ratio. Kind of like right now it's at 15:1 air-fuel ratio. And as I begin to lean into it, there it goes, 14. Okay, right there I probably need to get the power valve opening sooner because it went to 14 and kind of hung there. And I don't want to be at high load and that lean, so I need to put a 10.5 power valve in it. And also look at the jetting. All right, so what I'm going to do is drive this thing around a bit and report back on what it may need. But as of right now, it is radically improved. It's even better than the other carburetor was after I tuned it. Man, I went out and drove this thing a lot. I got on the freeway, I cruised at, just a reasonable speed. I leaned into it and very carefully watched the vacuum gauge and the air-fuel ratio gauge. And I gotta tell you, I love doing this because if you watched my last video about carburetor tuning, maybe you've got an idea of how all the circuits work together, and it is so cool to watch it in practice on the gauges. For example, I noted that cruising at 65 miles an hour, I am still on the idle circuit. It takes such light throttle with a 276 rear gear that it's still on the idle circuit or transfer circuit. And as you just lean into it, you can see it go into the main jet. And the main jet at first is a little bit lean, but then when you get into it more, you get more airflow, more velocity, more pressure drop, and it starts to pull more fuel. It's working great. The other thing is I was able to drive it at a higher load and sort of slowly lean into it. And when you do that, you can watch the vacuum gauge and see exactly the point where that power valve opens. Unfortunately, when it does that, it's way too rich. and it's also probably too lean at light cruise. And I'll say that light cruise, that is an example of why the carburetor tune-up changes with the vehicle weight and gearing. Because in this case, it is cruising at 65 at such low RPM that the throttle blades are almost closed and you're not getting a lot of pressure drop, pulling a lot of fuel. Whereas if it had a 410 gear in the back, you'd have a lot more RPM, a lot more, pressure drop. It would be basically sucking on the carburetor harder and you'd get more fuel. I just love working all that stuff out. It's cool. So it does have a couple of places where I would like to fix it. And so let me hop out and think that through, and I'll tell you what I'm gonna do. Oh man, the throttle whack is great. Sitting at an idle, you can just wah! It's like that. Carburetor tuning is cool. All right, let me go decide what I'm gonna do. Okay, here are the problems that I think that I have. First of all, when I'm cruising at that very light load, the air-fuel ratio on the gauge reads sometimes leaner than 15:1. And even though that's an extreme light load, I feel that's a little bit too lean. Also because you have to remember that the oxygen sensor for the gauge is reading an average of 4 cylinders. So when it says 15:1, I could have 2 cylinders that are richer than that and 2 cylinders that are leaner than that. And a leaner to 15:1 is just not going to be good at all, even at light load. So I've got to richen that up just a hair. And the second problem that I have is that when you get into the secondaries and that power valve opens, it is rich. It is 10:1, which I think is probably the limit of that gauge. And so I need to lean that out. Now, in my other episode that I keep talking about, where I showed you in-depth carburetor tuning, I tried really hard to use the scientific method and only make one change at a time. But in truth, out here in the real world, when I'm messing around with this stuff, I feel like I know the carburetor kind of well enough that I can go ahead and make a couple of changes. So that's what I'm going to do. First of all, I'm going to put a 10.5 power valve in it and get that enrichment open sooner. Because right now, as you lean into it, it can be like 14:1 under a fairly heavy load. And the 6.5 power valve means that it's going to open when the manifold vacuum drops below 6.5. Well, you got to be deep in the throttle for that to happen on this engine. So by putting a 10.5, that means it will enrich when the manifold vacuum drops below 10.5 inches, which means it's going to happen sooner, which is something that I need. But then it's so rich, what I'd really like to do is change those power valve feed restrictors and make them smaller so it flows less fuel when the power valve opens. That would be ideal. I don't have those special jets. And so that's going to happen, I think, with secondary jets. I'm going to have to lean those out and see if it helps that situation. And then in the front, with it being too lean, I think what I'm going to do is sacrifice a little bit of idle leanness and richen up the idle just a little bit, because remember that the idle screws actually contribute to the fuel curve everywhere. It's cumulative. And so if I richen that up a little bit, it's going to richen up the whole thing, but especially that light load cruise. And then I probably will also put smaller idle air bleeds in the front. So to review all that gobbledygook, I'm going to richen up the idle mixture screws. I'm going to put slightly smaller idle air bleeds in it, which will bleed in less air and therefore more fuel, and richen up the transfer slot just a little bit and activate it sooner. I'm going to put a 10.5 power valve in it, and I'm probably going to take 2 or 3 jet sizes out of the back, 2 or 3 sizes smaller. Let's rip through that. Now's when we find out if all of those changes worked. Here's what I did. Went from a 6.5 power valve to a 10.5. The secondary jets were number 74. I made a big swing and went to 70. And the idle air bleeds were a 63, and I made a pretty big swing and went to 59. I've now got the thing idling, as it reads on this gauge, at 12.9 to 13.1 air-fuel ratio. So what I'm going to be looking for now is it a little bit richer than my former 15 to 1 at very light cruise, and is it a little bit leaner than my former 10 to 1 at wide open throttle? And does the power valve come in sooner so I'm not driving under load at 14-ish to 1? And I think that one's almost certain to be fixed. The question is the light cruise and the wide open. Okay, this is promising. I'm cruising at 60 miles an hour, and instead of 15 to 1, it's now 13.7 to 1. So that's pretty good. Could be a hair leaner, but it's safe. Especially considering that deal I pointed out to you where some cylinders could be richer and some could be leaner. It surprises a lot of people to discover that it's not the same air-fuel ratio in every single cylinder, and that's because of intake manifold design. You know, you also have to think of your testing in different gears. Obviously, cruising on the highway, I will test in 4th gear, but it is interesting to put it in different gears and see how the different RPM changes what the AFR might be. You'll notice one thing I did not mess with is that screw that adjusts the opening point and rate of the vacuum diaphragm to open up the secondaries. It felt okay on my initial drive, so I just left it alone. But remember, if you mess with that, it can affect the air-fuel ratio at different points at part throttle. As it's opening more or less, it's going to draw more or less fuel out of those barrels, and obviously more air, but it's something to look at if you do make some changes on that pod. One thing you have to watch when you're testing when you go to wide open is, of course, you squirt all that raw fuel in there out of the accelerator pump discharge nozzle, and so that spikes the thing really rich. You have to wait for that to clear out a little bit, wait for the gauge to react before you really know what the air-fuel ratio is. Unfortunately, you got to hang it wide open a little bit. The drag strip's by far the best place to do that, especially when you're in LA traffic. That's getting worse. It's a few days later. You can see that there's a new guest in the background over there. You'll be seeing that in upcoming videos. All right, the last round of carburetor changes that I made was really good. Any hint of stumble or anything in the front half of the carburetor is flawless. However, I sort of created a new problem in the back half. What I'm seeing now is I dip into the throttle kind of heavy and it gets way too lean in some conditions before the power valve opens. And when the power valve opens, it goes right to 10 to 1. 10 to 1 air fuel ratio, stinky rich, way too much fuel, not enough air. Rear jet change done. It had 70s in it. I richened it up to number 74 with larger jets. Now let's go work on the front of the carburetor. The primary metering block is off. That is the power valve. I'm going to remove it and show you what goes on with the power valve channel restrictors. Now the power valve is out, and this is a very special metering block that has adjustable idle feed restrictors and also power valve channel restrictors. It's why I got this carburetor, so that I can do this step. Recall that the power valve is the thing that opens up when the engine's under high load to deliver more fuel for that demanding situation. This is the channel that it goes in, and this metering block has basically what look like little jets that go inside it that control how much fuel is delivered when the power valve opens. Just think of them as maybe train jets and you'll understand exactly what they are doing. So I'm going to pull this one out and then measure it, and then we'll decide what to do. This is going to take your tiniest screwdriver. They are different than the idle air bleeds in the choke horn or in the back of the carburetor. These are a tiny, tiny little jet just for this and for emulsion bleeds. And as a matter of fact, it is so dinky, there is no chance that there is a number on it. Maybe there is. Maybe my magnifier on my phone would be able to tell me what number it is. But the far better thing for you to do is to get one of these pin gauge sets. So these are just little cylinders, little sticks, pieces of metal that are machined to precision sizes, and you use them to measure the diameter of inside holes on little tiny things like this. I will start with 30 thousandths. That goes right through. Felt like 35. That goes right through. Let's try 40. These are big. Wow. 55. Not quite. 52. Okay. Using my little pin gauges, I have determined that the orifice in this jet is 52 thousandths of an inch. However, I am going to go in and double check the size of this gauge, which is in fact just the tiniest speck under 52 thousandths. So yeah, it's like 51 3/4. Okay, now that I understand that, I can make a decision. Remember that my problem is that it's way too rich when the power valve opens. And so I need to restrict these, but they're so tiny that a very small change makes a big percentage of difference. And so I'm just gonna move in a 2 thousandths increment. In other words, right now it is 52 thousandths, and I wanna go to a 50 thousandths. So I'm going to open up my handy dandy little kit and note that I do not have a 50 thousandths jet. Unfortunately, this assortment has 52, 46, 40, 31, and 20. So I'm going to take out a blank jet and drill it myself. That's where the next specialty tool comes into play. This is a hand drill bit set that is going to have the sizes I need. Look at those tiny drill bits. Let me find one at 50 thousandths. There isn't one at 50 thousandths. All right, so that's a problem that I don't have the drill bit that's the right size. What I wanted to show you is how you can put these tiny drill bits in this tiny, what they call a vise, or a holder for the drill bits. And then you can drill out the little tiny brass jets by hand, just by twirling this thing. But that operation failed, and so I think what I'm gonna do, because we know that I have a 52 thousandths jet and the next size down in this kit is 46 thousandths, you know, that's a 6 thousandths change, which at this tiny orifice size is a big change. But you know what? The thing is way too rich. It reads 10:1, and maybe the gauge doesn't read any worse than that. So I'm gonna go ahead and give the 46 a shot and go drive the duster and find out if it's way too lean when it opens up the power valve. All right, let me try this number 46 power valve channel restriction. I don't love it. I'm gonna be really careful. Maybe it'll be dead on. All right, to summarize, when I first took it apart, this thing had 52 thousandths power valve channel restrictors. I wanted to go in and change it just by 2 thousandths, but I didn't have the right drill, and so I used what was in the kit, which was 46 thousandths, which is a whopping change. It is 6 thousandths of an inch change, which at this tiny hole is a big deal. I'm gonna put it back together, and either I will have nailed it, or it's gonna be radically too lean. Right now it's radically too rich, so who knows? Maybe I stumbled into the right solution. driving again. It's gonna take a little bit. I gotta go through a bunch of different throttle positions and loads. What I'm looking for is that it doesn't go too lean before the power valve opens, and it doesn't go too rich when the power valve opens. Okay, let's head for home. I'm back, and man, this thing runs good. I mean, I am refining it down to the last molecule. The last couple things I did really paid off. Putting bigger jets in the back made it richer at that point of sort of high load before the power valve opened. Now, the thing about wide open throttle performance is that I did lean it out a bunch, but it's still rich. The thing is, it's about 11.8 to 1 in second and third gear wide open. And then if you do it in fourth at lower RPM and go wide open for a while and let the pump shot clear out so you get a nice reading, it's still 10.5 to 1. It's really rich, but I think I'm gonna leave it there because I don't want to risk making it too lean in other conditions. Now, here's the thing I just learned. While I was driving, I was matting it, and it was going through a period of a little detonation. I'm like, what is going on? And I was looking at the AFR gauge, and I realized I think what was happening is the secondaries weren't opening soon enough, and it wasn't drawing enough fuel out of the primaries, but it was drawing enough air to get to a point where it was way too lean. I got out the screwdriver that I normally use to open the trunk, and I backed out the adjusting screw on the secondary diaphragm, and it ended up needing one full turn out, and sure enough, it fixed that problem. That was me learning something right there. As soon as I dumped the secondaries open quicker, it flowed fuel quicker, and it did not have that detonation problem, man. I'm kind of stoked on figuring this stuff out. You know, it's not EFI. You can't tune it to every precise little tiny thing. And as we've seen on the dyno, when you go wide open throttle under a fixed load, still the fuel curve has whoop-de-doos in it. So, as I said, it's not EFI, but I'm getting it really, really good. If you were to drive this thing right now and I told you that it was throttle body injection, you would buy into it. It's that good. All right, I'm gonna do one more thing, which is I am gonna take the high-speed air bleeds in the back and I'm gonna go down probably 2 sizes on them to bring in that heavy throttle pre-power valve number just a little bit richer. And I would actually like just a little bit smaller power valve restrictions, and I'm not sure I can pull that off. So let me do that final little tweak. I'm just not gonna be happy until it's like, man, this is cool. Okay, that last maneuver with the air bleeds really wasn't worth anything. I changed it from a 31 thousandths to a 30 because that's what I had. I didn't want to jump to a 27 that I also had because those tiny, tiny holes makes a big difference with a very small change. I did change them. We'll see, it might help a little bit. I think the bottom line is I'm not going to beat this thing to death anymore. I've shown you kind of what is possible and how it all works, but I do want to explain air bleeds. I did this in my last in-depth carburetor video, but I want to explain air bleeds again. I think it bears repeating. I went in depth on them in my last carburetor video, but let's explain it again. On a typical street carburetor, there are high-speed air bleeds, which are closer to the center, and idle air bleeds, which are on the outside. Most carburetors, they're not adjustable. On these brawlers, they are. And what they are is a metered orifice, or a hole of varying sizes, that allows air into the fuel well to create an emulsion that is then delivered to the engine. And so in addition to the main jet adjusting how much fuel gets there, the air bleed adjusts how much air gets there. And so by putting a smaller hole, a smaller bleed in it, you are richening the mixture because you're reducing the air. Conversely, a larger bleed adds more air and leans the mixture, but it does one more thing, which is kind of what I was working on here. The smaller hole activates the circuit sooner and delivers the emulsion to the engine sooner. Here's why. Imagine a drinking straw. You've all had one that has a hole in it. Well, if it has a tiny hole, you can tell that it's there, but you can suck on the straw and you can get some soda. If it's a big hole, think about it. You have to suck much harder and longer to get the soda up the straw, and when it gets there, it has a whole lot more air mixed in it. It's exactly what a bleed does. So you can see how a larger bleed, with the engine creating a pressure drop, the larger bleed takes longer for the fuel to get there. The smaller bleed, it gets there faster. It activates the circuit sooner. Okay, that's that. I think it is finally time to conclude the differences between the 750 double pumper and the 600 vacuum secondary. Oh, before I do that, check out my new Leadfoot t-shirt. These are cool. See how it's got the old cast aluminum gas pedal in a sandal with the DF logo and says Leadfoot? This is just one of many t-shirts that you can buy from my store in order to enter the giveaway that I'm having for my Chevy Suburban 4x4 before December 7th, 2025. You can also enter for free. Look at the rules on the website. You can mail in a postcard or buy stuff. Okay, now let's wrap up 750 versus 600. Before I get into this wrap up, I realize there's two more things that I wanted to tell you. One of which is, anytime you're dealing with those little tiny power valve restrictor jets or emulsion bleeds or even air bleeds in the top of the carburetor, it's a really good idea to check them with those little pin gauges that I showed you. Case in point, I didn't reveal in the video, but when I changed the power valve restrictions, I pulled some out of the box and checked them, and sure enough, there were some that were in the wrong compartment of the box. And if I hadn't have checked them, I would have put in something that was completely off the plot. So check that. The other thing I wanted to mention is I've talked about my Suburban giveaway. Look for all of the details and rules about that in a link that is in my description. And now, let's discuss 750 versus 600, double pumper versus vacuum secondary. You know, the 750 double pumper is my go-to carburetor. I'm prone to overcarburate things. Steve Dulcich and I have made Holley 1,000 CFM carburetors drive just fine on 318 Mopars. It's possible. And in the last carburetor episode, I think you saw that I made this thing pretty good. The downside is that I had to do some really crazy things on the tuning of it in order to make it work on this bone stock 360 Mopar. Stock cam, stock heads, it does have an intake, it does have headers on it. And I think in this episode I proved what every reasonable tuner has known since time began, which is that the 600 vacuum secondary is better for this application. But let's talk through that. First of all, you saw me make the 750 work. If you are planning on upgrading your engine, if you're gonna throw a cam in it, you're gonna put heads in it, you're gonna put lower gears in it, more converter, whatever, you might as well get the 750 so you're not buying a carburetor twice. And of course, obviously, the more radical you get, the larger the carburetor you can put on the thing. But you know that when you have a bone stock or very mild V8, this is probably not your choice, although I will argue for a 750 vacuum secondary being a really good choice on a mild V8. Now in this case, mild means it's making 290, 300 horsepower, something like that, on a good day. So the 600 vacuum secondary is key for a couple reasons. First of all, the smaller Venturi was able to give me better response right from the hit. That just bare tip in off idle stumble, gone. I was able to tune this thing so that it revs like as fast as that engine is ever going to rev. Also, the vacuum secondary means that you're going to cruise around on primaries more often, and you'll never be in a situation where you've got the throttle open enough that you're hanging the secondaries open when you probably shouldn't be, and delivering more fuel and air than you really need. Now, the Quick Fuel 600 that I chose, it is part number SL for Slayer 600. It is one of the more affordable Holley-type 600 vacuum secondaries, and it has those killer features of the adjustable bleeds and restrictions, and it also has center hung float bowls, so it looks cooler, and it has the adjustable jets in the metering plate in the back. So I consider it a fantastic value. And out of the box onto the Duster, it actually ran pretty good. If you just did that and weren't too picky and didn't have an air fuel ratio gauge, you would probably think that it was ideal right out of the box, except for maybe just a little bit of a stumble that's easy to cure. Now, in my case, I was able to really fine tune the thing so that I love it. As a matter of fact, I think I'm going to get one and put one on my C20. Not that the Edelbrock that's on it is bad. The Edelbrocks typically come out of the box and run okay. I just am more familiar with the design of the Holley, and I can geek out on it and make it just so much better. The other thing about this combo is when I drove the Duster to where did I go? A loop of Utah. I got 17 miles to gallon just driving straight on the highway, and that was with the carburetor out of the box. What is it going to get now that it's like 3 points leaner, and now that it has vacuum advance? Could this be a 20 mile per gallon deal? I don't know. There's only one way to find out. More road trips with the red Duster. But I do have a little bit more wrenching I want to do on it, so look for that on the David Freiburger channel. Sign up for my sweepstakes before December 7th, 2025. Links in the description. And I will see you next time for more wrenching and adventuring.